Good evening, and welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where we're very pleased to welcome to the program Nicholas Wade. And Mr. Wade is the author of an extremely interesting new book I'd like to show here at the outset called A World Beyond Healing, subtitled Prologue and Aftermath of Nuclear War. And Mr. Wade, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you.
You're on the editorial board of the New York Times and concerned with broad questions of science and so forth for the editorial board of the Times. This subject is one that you've been interested in for a very long time out of your general scientific readings and reading and education and so forth. And when did you get the idea of putting together a specific book which went in such detail into the questions of nuclear buildup, many of the esoteric questions of deterrence strategy and so forth? When did the idea formulate in your mind to put together the book, if we may, and then we could talk about some of the specifics? When did you get the idea?
Sure. Well, it was the request of my publisher, who noticed that there was a lot of scientific debate and discussion on many of these areas involving nuclear war and how we might get into it. And they asked me to put together a book for the general reader which would explain some of the scientific reappraisals that are now going on.
Of how we got into it, because at a layman's level and at even increasingly many people's levels, the words are increasingly used. It's absurd. It's absurd that we build up such nuclear destruction to where we can destroy ourselves many times over and so forth. But there is a geostrategic thinking, and there's a rationale, and there's a reason and an understanding of how this arms race and the missile race and the atomic bomb race and so forth developed, and you've gone into it in great realistic detail that gives an understanding of it, perhaps from the geostrategic thinking of the esoteric few who seem to really understand it in clear detail. Does it seem appropriate to say?
Yes, I've tried to explain...
Yes, and you've done very well, if I may.
Well, thanks. I've tried to explain why the nuclear arsenals are so large, far in excess of what an irrational person might think would be ample
Why
deterrent.
are they? Yeah.
Well, essentially, it's that if you have very few nuclear weapons, and you get into a nuclear exchange, the only thing you can do with those few weapons is to obliterate the other side's cities. And that will prompt the other side to obliterate your cities. There's something else you can do with more nuclear weapons, and that is to target the other side's military targets. And for that you need a lot more nuclear weapons. So at least the president has the option. He doesn't have to go after Soviet cities in the event of a nuclear exchange. He can go after Soviet missiles, Soviet submarines, Soviet military targets. And for that he needs a lot more nuclear weapons at his disposal, and that gives him a lot more flexibility. The old doctrine, the mutually assured destruction, or MAD, that describes the old policy of hitting just the other side's cities and destroying the other side's society. What we have now, the doctrine of flexible response, is an attempt to get away from MAD and to hope that if a nuclear exchange started, it could be confined to military targets, and the violence could be stopped, the exchange could be stopped at the lowest possible level of...
Didn't Henry Kissinger write about this back in the 1950s, or is that talking in a certain sense about a tactical, if that's the right term, or a less than all-out nuclear exchange between the nations, so that there's a geostrategic thinking that we could use nuclear weapons in a balanced response or in a less than all-out response, and that prerogative is there that's necessary to have that there at the people who have geostrategic responsibility?
Well, that's right. That is the theory. Now, there are many people who say that once the first nuclear weapons are exchanged, you go right up the ladder to full exchange of every bomb in the arsenal.
Right onto MAD, then.
That's right, and that it's foolish to prepare to fight a nuclear war because the only possible outcome is for each side to let off all its weapons. Now, that may be true, but still, when it comes down to it, it's better for the president to have options than to have no options. And that is why we have what seems to be such an apparent excess of missiles and submarines and bombers and so forth.
I wonder if you could take through us the history of that then. MAD, mutually assured destruction, would have been the targeting of cities and rendering the general question of mutual deterrence between the two nuclear powers. And when would MAD have begun to be supplemented by this other flexibility, a flexible system historically in terms of years? When does MAD reach its epitome, and when do we begin to shift into this other pattern that you're talking about as the modern one?
Man reached its epitome during the Eisenhower-Dulles era. And the policy was first announced by Secretary of State Dulles. And it was at a time when, before the Sino-Soviet split, when we kept very small conventional forces. And we feared we were going to be at a terrible disadvantage compared to the vast manpower reserves of the Soviet Union and China combined. The fear was that, when we were tied down in North Korea, the Soviets would then seize the opportunity to attack in Europe.
Yeah, the arguments of more bang for the buck, that the atomic weapons were cheaper than conventional warfare, just in economic terms.
Indeed, they are very much cheaper. And Eisenhower made the choice, instead of running up an enormous deficit with an enormous defense budget,
militarizing the country,
as Mr. Reagan has, Eisenhower deliberately chose to keep a very small conventional army, to build up nuclear forces as our deterrent, and it's out of that the doctrine of mutually assured destruction came. Well, McNamara tried to get away from that, and he made the first steps towards the doctrine of flexible response, which actually was put into place by James Schlesinger when he was Ford Secretary of Defense. And he laid out a number of things we should do, which the Reagan administration is finally putting into hard metal.
Such as?
Well, one of the things is to try and harden your command and control. It's very important to keep control over nuclear weapons. Firstly, so you can fire them if you have to, and so that you can not fire them if you wish to negotiate the end, the termination of a nuclear war. But all forms of communications are extremely vulnerable to attack. They're all soft targets. There's something called the electromagnetic pulse, one of the effects of nuclear weapons, that knocks out command and control. Hardening all this stuff is extremely difficult and expensive, and that's one of the major initiatives that the Reagan administration has taken to implement the Schlesinger doctrine and the Carter doctrine, which also went along the same lines.
Was there a retargeting, or with missiles and with other delivery systems, was there a sense of retargeting? I presume the missile bases or missiles are targeted one by the other and so forth. The retarget, because you said away from, let's say, cities and so forth, toward military targets on each other's territory. There was a tendency to target the missiles as they were known to exist and so forth?
That's right. No one knows exactly what is targeted, but it's certainly been announced that in general terms we do not target cities per se. In other words, we might hit a military base which is near a Soviet city, but it's not part of our doctrine to target Soviet cities for the sake of destroying them. And I believe the Soviets have announced the same is true in their targeting policy.
And yet within the overall capability of the nuclear capability, there is again the possibility and the existence of sufficient force for us to in fact obliterate each other's society, which was the basis of MAD. And the idea of deterrence is still part of the geostrategic thinking, and has been the balance that some people say, other people argue differently and so forth, has been the thing that has kept the peace between the two nations for 40 years, the fact of atomic deterrence between the two major powers?
I think both those things are true. Certainly if we had a full nuclear exchange, it would certainly obliterate half our population just in a matter of weeks, and the prospects for the economic survival would be very bleak from a full exchange, slightly different from an exchange confined to military targets. And yes, nuclear deterrence has been and still is our policy, and I think I don't think anyone disputes that up to now it has indeed worked. Without nuclear deterrence, I'm sure we and the Russians would have been at each other's throats a dozen times in the last 40 years.
Had there not been nuclear deterrence, do you think we would have been at each other's throats in the conventional warfare sense?
I think so. In the last conventional war, 50 million people died in the Second World War. The conventional wars are very destructive. Very
destructive, and conventional forces are still something that had to be brought in play. Mr. Gorbachev just gave a speech September of this year wherein he took the position that the 40 years of peace have been despite the deterrence of the atomic weapons rather than the fact that they did exist. But there are many people within the geostrategic thinking that feel that deterrence has been the thing that has kept the peace. We're now coming to a time where there is an announcement they're going to withdraw missiles 50% from Western Europe, medium and short-range missiles. Mr. Gorbachev has proposed a 50% reduction in strategic missiles. Are you optimistic, if that's the right term, that we're on the right course in terms of handling the destructive capability of the atomic weapons as these plans that have been enunciated by the Soviet Union and announced by the agreements between the Soviet Union and the United States about the reduction of nuclear missiles and so forth in Europe, and also opening up the door perhaps to a reduction of strategic missiles? Or what is your general feeling about the situation as it exists between the two major powers of the world now?
Well, I think it is much more hopeful than it has been for a long time. I think it's certainly true that Mr. Gorbachev, seeking to rebuild his domestic economy, wants desperately to switch resources away from his military and into his economy.
And that suggests that all the world would be well to do so.
Right. I think we should take advantage of that desire, even if it means giving him a breathing space, even if it means a Soviet Union with a stronger economy, which might later become the base for a renewed threat against us. I think we have to take advantage of that and meet him halfway. The INF agreement, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement in Europe, which you mentioned, is useful. I think that the hard criterion of any arms control agreement is does it reduce the risk of a nuclear exchange?
Yes.
And by and large, the INF agreement doesn't particularly do that. And the risk of a nuclear exchange relates really to the particular weapons that each side has that are destabilizing, the weapons that you have to use or lose in a crisis, like the vulnerable but very threatening land-based missile force the Soviet Union has. Those are very threatening weapons. Those are the things that we most need to get rid of.
Defensive weapons can be destabilizing.
The offensive weapons.
Defensive weapons can as well be destabilizing in terms of the balance between.
And the defensive weapons too can be destabilizing. If you have something like the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars system, which the Reagan administration wishes to go ahead with right now.
Yeah, we want to talk about that. Yeah.
Any system you went ahead with right now would be very ineffective against an initial Soviet attack, but it will be quite effective against a Soviet retaliation. In other words, if we hit the Soviets first and then use the shield to block off their ragged second strike, then it might work. That is why it is so destabilizing, because an ineffective system appears to the other side as if it's a shield that you are using to accompany your first strike. That's why it's destabilizing.
If you were to be in a position and they were to ask you to give advice as to the policy directions the United States might take, what would be your prescription as you think, and you've thought it through obviously very carefully, what do you think is the best pattern for the Western, well, let's say the United States, Western powers, or the world to follow in order to reach, as you say, a more stabilized, appropriate world, given the fact that these weapons do exist and given the geostrategic realities, as you see it?
Well, first, we should use the success in the INF negotiations. We should use that momentum to go ahead with an agreement on strategic arms. That means the missiles that can reach the other side's territory, not just the ones in Europe.
As much as a 50% reduction is being proposed, or
well,
has that not been proposed?
It has been proposed, yeah. It's not so much the size of the cut that's important, because you can be just as unstable with 50% less weapons. It's rather the nature of the weapons that are cut. If we could get the Soviets to withdraw their SS-18 and SS-19 missiles, those are big, heavy land-based missiles that are very vulnerable, and so therefore the Soviets must use them the instant they think we might attack them. If we could get rid of those weapons and make the Soviets replace them with mobile missiles, or else put them out to sea in submarines, that would be a great step towards strategic stability. That's one thing I think we should try and...
What would be a comparable on the part of the United States that are so vulnerable, such as the 18 and the 19, as you suggested, on the United States or the Western side?
Well, we built the MX missile, which we're having great trouble deploying. But the MX missile is a rough equivalent to the heavy Soviet missiles. Also, our Minuteman missiles,
which is going forward apparently. Or?
No, those are our old missiles.
The
Minuteman 3 missiles. These two are becoming vulnerable to Soviet first strike. So these two are, in that sense, destabilizing missiles. We should try and base those in some different way, or agree to get rid of them. I think another thing we should do is to continue research on defenses. To deploy defenses is forbidden by the ABM Treaty.
It is indeed.
The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of '72. But I think our vigorous research program in that is something that the Soviets find very hard to match. And it's something which I think has helped bring them to the bargaining table this time, and it will keep the pressure on them to come forward and make useful strategic accords with us.
You don't think that's a step toward the militarization of space or something of that sort, as some critics of the SDI philosophy feel, or Soviets would feel, that we're going to build an arms race into the space or something?
It is a step towards the militarization of space. In a sense, space is already militarized. I mean, a lot of our military satellites, which we depend on crucially, are in space. I think there are various agreements that are in both sides' interests, such as an agreement to ban anti-satellite missiles. That's something we should push for very strongly. I still accept the logic of the ABM Treaty, that defenses are destabilizing because they prompt the other side to increase its offensive missiles. Therefore, I would much prefer that we do not deploy a defense. But I do like the idea of continuing with a strong research program that might yield a workable defense in future years. Not because I want to build such a defense, but because I think the mere existence of this program is something that will keep the Russians' attention, which will play to our strength, which is in technology, and which will be a lever for us to use on the Soviet Union to continue to make the kind of useful, stabilizing arms control agreements that are in our mutual interest.
We've talked about the United States and the Western powers, the Soviet Union. Would you want to react on the on Mr. Gorbachev himself and the positions that he has taken, or let's say the Soviet Union? There seems to be, one doesn't want to be naive or anything, there seems to be a very seriously changed attitude on the part of the Soviet Union toward the broader geopolitical realities. I wonder if you'd want to comment generally on what your thinking is as far as things are seen from the Soviet perspective on a world scale.
Well, the Soviet Union has clearly recognized that its economy is in shambles, and it wishes to reform it and restructure it. I think that there are two major questions to which we do not yet have answers. One is, how long will Mr. Gorbachev himself survive? I think it's in our interest that he should survive.
You mean
and
politically?
Should be successful. Yes. I mean, the last reformer in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, was booted out. For Mr. Gorbachev's reforms to work, he has to antagonize almost every interest in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he's taking a very principled stand in a certain sense.
Very principled, but in political terms, it's a high-risk course.
Do we get good readings as to how he's doing in the Soviet Union? He's doing well in the West. He's being well received in the West and so forth. But are there rumblings in the Soviet Union? Or perhaps it's not your bailiwick or your area of expertise?
Well, I certainly don't set myself up as an expert in the Soviet Union, but I certainly follow it. I mean, it was noticeable that when he was on holiday for 6 weeks, there was no one in Moscow promoting his agenda.
Okay. Given the agenda, though, and given the general attitude of favoring, seemingly, he gave this speech saying that the weapons of destruction and there should be emphasis put upon underpinning the United Nations. There should be emphasis on human development, and a general attitude that was one with great self-confidence and with great seeming common sense that this is absurd, the situation we're in. We have to move into a new era. The material realities are changing such that it allows us to do that. And taking a broad historical perspective that seems to have caught the imagination of a great deal of the world's citizenry, it seems.
I think that's right. Soviet foreign policy is much more flexible than it was before. It's playing very well abroad. And indeed, in practice, the Soviet Union is being much more easy to cope with. For example, in the Persian Gulf, they're pursuing a policy which is somewhat parallel to our own, though of course not identical.
Yeah, well, those are just some of the questions having to do raising out of because you give considerable attention in the book to the growth of thinking, as it were, and you emphasize the fact that people who seem to have an understanding of the intricacies of deterrence and the intricacies of thinking geostrategically is relatively small, and you've gone into that in great detail, and I just wanted to talk about some of those issues. The book is the prologue and aftermath of nuclear war, so you've given attention to, you've read Jonathan Schell's Fate of the Earth and other kinds of things about the aftermath of what a Soviet war, I mean a nuclear war would mean. It's horrendous. It is not, in your estimation, it is something that is not the end of the species, or it's not the end of, what would be, how do you see that? If you thought it through carefully, you read it through carefully, what would be the aftermath of nuclear war?
Well, if one discusses the best and the worst cases, and the best case, which is that you have an exchange of just a few nuclear weapons, and that is enough to bring the leaders on either side to their senses. If you had an exchange that was more or less confined, say, to military targets, to the Russians hit our missile silos and we hit their missile silos, that would cause about 20 million dead in the United States. That would be an unparalleled catastrophe, but it wouldn't be the end of our economy, and we would survive. If you had an all-out exchange, the casualties go up to about 150 million. That is pretty serious, and it leaves certainly open to doubt whether we will be able to reconstitute our economy. And a lot would depend on how much help was available from outside. After all, 2 nuclear weapons have already been dropped in the world, and the 2 that landed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You can't see a trace of those weapons right now. The Japanese recovered very quickly.
There was no genetic damage, apparently, from that.
There was no genetic damage, that's right. And there was massive help that started to pour in from outside and help the people in those 2 cities, even though Japan had been totally devastated by conventional fire rates in most of its major cities. So the question is, if there were full-out nuclear exchange between us and the Soviet Union, how much help would be available from, say, Canada, from South America, from parts of the world that wish to help us, that are our friends, and how quickly could they get that help there? And these things are just imponderables.
Yeah, they are, and they can only be done within scenario to a certain degree, I guess. I mean, in terms of trying to project.
Right. I think it's unlikely to say, though, that all life in the Northern Hemisphere will be obliterated. I just think that is unlikely.
Even given an all-out exchange.
Right. But however, if our economy collapsed beyond hope of repair, then that's a pretty dismal outcome too.
Yes,
and I think
indeed,
that is more likely.
Well, of course it is. And then there's also ecological depletion. I wonder, I don't know, so Nagasaki, Hiroshima were fission-based atomic bombs. The weapons at Bikini, the testing, the Marshall Islands in the 50s and so forth, was there genetic damage shown from those, or perhaps you haven't researched it? I mean, has there been genetic damage shown from the radiation? There was not apparently Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but was there in other cases? Or do you perhaps not know? I mean, it's not a...
I think I'm right in saying that there hasn't been any recorded cases of... let me back up a little. There certainly is congenital damage.
Yeah, all right,
many children born to parents who were irradiated at Hiroshima have various defects. But those defects do not include genetic defects.
Right, I understand.
In other words, the children of those children are perfectly normal so far as we can tell.
And that has been the case with these things throughout other instances, hydrogen-based things, Marshall Islands in the 50s and so forth, where there was testing done.
That's right. That is correct.
Okay, there are other ecological things. I wonder if you could touch briefly on it. The atomic weapons that have been detonated in the scenarios, they've had effect, do you think, on the ozone and the ozone depletion? And how much effect has that? Has there been a direct result between atomic weaponry and, or let's say ecological effect, particularly with reference to the ozone question?
I think I'm right in saying there has been no detectable increase on the ozone layer of the nuclear weapons exploded in atmospheric tests. And we stopped doing atmospheric tests in 1963 because of the treaty to ban atmospheric testing. And ozone goes through quite wide natural fluctuations. So people looked to see some effects on the ozone layer, but it was very hard to be sure you could see anything within those big fluctuations. So if there were any effect, it would have been a small one. However, certainly if you had an all-out nuclear exchange, that would have a very large effect on the ozone layer, because nuclear weapons create oxides of nitrogen in the atmosphere, as the nitrogen and the oxygen combine together. And if enough of these get high into the stratosphere, they will act as catalysts to break down ozone and severely erode the ozone layer.
Do you see that as a real premise? A little aside, you're interested in science in general. Is that a real that ozone depletion is a real problem?
Yes, it's a very alarming problem.
Yeah.
I mean, people who study climate are used to the concept that the world climate is such a big system that it's very hard to make any lasting change in it. Any pressure you put on is immediately counteracted or buffered by some other change. So climatologists were amazed. They couldn't believe their data when they first saw that a vast hole had opened in the ozone layer over Antarctica.
Yeah, that's one that is more and more concerned about. This book is, I wonder if I could ask you a general philosophical. You've written, again, an extremely well-written, well-researched, and well-to-be-recommended book in terms of a realistic understanding of geostrategy, which is highly recommended and so forth. I wonder yourself personally, if you would, perhaps it's not fair of me to ask, are you optimistic concerning the human prospect, given having researched this most horrendous possible scenario that we could imagine? Are you optimistic that we can avoid this, or what is your general philosophical sensing in terms of the human prospect?
I think I am optimistic. I think we've gone through a period of history when we needed a nuclear deterrent, when it was very useful. And I think we may be entering a period of history when maybe the need for nuclear weapons will become less pressing, and therefore I think it's possible to entertain the hope that one day we can do away with them. And after all, if the Soviet Union evolves into a more peaceful society, one which is not necessarily like ours, but one in which it does not consist of an old imperial-style empire that needs to keep lots of countries subservient to it by force, there's no reason why it shouldn't pursue altogether more peaceful objectives. And therefore there's no reason why we should need to have a nuclear deterrent as part of our relationship with the Soviet Union.
I see, and that would probably go both ways to the degree that there has been among the nations of the world imperialism manifest by various nations at various times throughout the history of the world, and still maintains that in a certain sense we might be able to find the ways between the nations of the world to find a peaceful way for the nations of the world to live in a way which they've had difficulty doing. But in that sense it would be very, very hopeful indeed if the technology and the capability and the scientific capability could be brought to good living repurpose. It could be very, very beneficial in terms of the human prospect. It could be almost, I don't want to use the word cavalierly, millennial in a very real sense, if we could find the way in which we could allow some of our capability to be applied to good living purpose.
Well, I agree. There's the possibility for a major change.
Yeah. Well, okay, fine. It's a big subject and go on in great degree. But again, let me just let the audience see again the book. It's called A World Beyond Healing, and its author, Nicholas Wade, it's been our pleasure to have as a guest here. He's with the editorial board at the New York Times. It's been a great pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.
Nicholas, thank you very, very much for coming in. We invite you to stay tuned. There'll be more coming up momentarily in the same general topic area, so please stay tuned. We're coming right back. That's it for this particular segment. Mr. Wade, once again, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
Stay tuned. Coming right back.
How do you find out when an administration is corrupt? How do you find out when a government is hiding the truth? How do you find out about those who would like you not to find out? To become better informed about the role of a free press and how it protects your rights, contact the First Amendment Center.
Do you have your passport?
For the third time, yes.
You have everything? Kids, relax. If we weren't grown-ups, they wouldn't have let us join the Peace Corps.
Peace Corps. It's creating food systems in Africa, building homes in Costa Rica, and fighting malaria in Asia. It's teaching math and learning French. It's working side by side. It's been tough, but for 25 years, the Peace Corps has been making a difference in the world.
Mom, Dad, I'm so proud of you.
Peace Corps, the toughest job you'll ever love.
In our country, where physical illness gets the most advanced medical treatment, a disease that affects 35 million Americans goes virtually untreated.
Why don't you just get up and pull yourself together and snap out of it?
The disease is mental illness, a disease that's often misunderstood, so its victims wind up neglected, isolated.
There is nothing more I can do for you.
But mental illness can be treated once you learn to see the sickness. For an informative booklet, call the American Mental Health Fund.
There was a time when an 18-year-old couldn't vote. A time when there was no meaningful way for young adults to express their opinions. What changed that? The 26th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution, the words we live by.
Welcome now to this section where we're pleased to welcome to the program Alex Miller. Mr. Miller is the executive director of an extremely interesting organization called the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. And Alex Miller, welcome very, very much to the conversation.
Thank you.
I wonder if you might share with me the committee. It got started, when, and so forth, the nuts and bolts of when the committee got started.
Well, its origins are in the early 1980s, like a lot of other anti-nuclear groups. It came in part out of the fear of some of the language coming out of the Reagan administration about fighting and winning a nuclear war.
Yeah.
It began, in a sense, with a paper by several professors of law, Richard Falk at Princeton University,
yes.
Elliot Meyerowitz, who now is a practicing lawyer, and Jerry Sanders. They did a study about how nuclear war relates to international law in general, whether there's not some hope to be found in international law by saying that nuclear war would be illegal in a sense. Mm-hmm. That was the idea behind the group.
Yeah.
And at the same time, a number of practicing lawyers in New York provided some of the financial and organizational support for it. It began in 1981. And we've been growing ever since. We're now up to about 600 associates who are lawyers around the country who contribute annually and help sponsor events in their local communities.
Yeah, you've been having some pretty interesting events recently we want to get to. But this idea of it having started with a particular perspective on international law must have been a little dismaying given the attitude of our country or this administration toward the tenets and institution of international law. It's not been particularly laudable in the recent experience. They walked away from the International Court of Justice and other things. It must have been a little bit dispiriting to people concerned with underpinning the instruments of international law to watch our own country's performance, I would have thought.
It is, in a sense, but there are times when the administration or people in the Senate or Congress cite international law. I mean, it's usually done to support their own perspective.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit disheartening in that sense. However, our group was founded on the ideal of abolishing nuclear weapons, and international law is going to have to play an integral role in abolition if that's where we're heading.
What would be, if you could, and of course you're not a legally trained international lawyer and that sort of thing, but what would be some of the tenets of international law that might be evoked in the name of calling into question the whole question of nuclear war as an illegal activity? There are tenets of international law that are worth being considered.
Sure.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm in a better position because I'm not a trained lawyer.
Maybe at that, yeah. Right, you might be at that, right.
The way I understand it is that there have been a number of agreements since the late 1800s, beginning in a sense with the Declaration of St. Petersburg, which may not be familiar to people, but other agreements which may be the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, the United Nations Charter itself.
Yeah.
And these agreements in their totality express limits to the amount of damage that can be done during warfare. It's an attempt to establish humanitarian standards for war. For example, after World War I, we're all familiar with the horrors of the mustard gas and the poison gases used then. There's a 1925 agreement banning the use of those types of gases. Now what we've done is to take these principles in their entirety, and to summarize a few of them, you must distinguish between civilians and combatants. You can't just target non-combatants.
Gee, that used to happen in night bombings in the Second War where they could only see cities. They began to start targeting. Well, I'm sorry.
Well, there have been massive violations of these principles, no question. But the principles in their totality say that any kind of nuclear use would be a violation because you can't discriminate, because it would have effects analogous to a poison gas, because it would be equivalent to causing genocide. Nuclear war is therefore illegal. Now, it is a tough position to take, as you're saying. It's international law is a slippery subject.
Yeah, it is indeed. Sovereignty still resides at the nation state and all those problems.
Certainly. But there are numerous examples of agreements being observed. I mean, poison gases were not used in World War II, to my knowledge, except for in the case of hostilities between China and Japan, I believe.
But there have been some instances where nations in their own interest were able to
have observed these agreements. And they're observed for the reason that any agreement is observed, because it's in the self-interest of the nation to do it. If Germany were to use poison gas weapons against U.S. troops during World War II, we would have done the same to them. So there was an aspect of deterrence there also. But the agreement had been codified and it was observed.
And there is a body of international law that's well worth, and having the expertise and the perspective of the international law community to bring to these questions. It's important, and the committee tends to do that, tends to have an international law perspective, and you're to be lauded for that. It's good that there is a function and a structure of that. You had a convention recently put together, it seems to me, and there's been these activities ongoing. You had a very interesting convention just in August of this year, 1987, that you maybe could talk some about if you would. That was an incredible event.
Yeah. It was the first U.S.-Soviet sponsored conference on these legal aspects of the nuclear debate. And it involved prominent lawyers from the United States, from the Soviet Union, and from, I believe, 15 other nations in all. So it was a very broad international conference. And we came together to look at some of the issues that we're talking about right now. Is the use of nuclear weapons illegal? If it is, so what? You know, how do you prevent them from being used? You know, and perhaps some forward-looking questions, such as is international law useful in developing a legal system that will prevent nations from using nuclear weapons?
Yeah, well, this is all very, very, right, go ahead, I'm sorry,
I mean, we're approaching these questions with a very open mind. I guess with a basic faith that there is some role for international law, a very strong role.
And there ought to be a stronger role of the rule of law among the nations of the world than there is generally accepted, no? I suppose you generally agree with that.
Yeah, I do agree with that, and I think perhaps the value of our group, being lawyers, being experts in their countries, is that although our goals are idealistic, we're looking at it very pragmatically. You know, what are the weaknesses of international law? What are the strengths? And where can it be useful down the road?
That's a very important question in and of itself, because if we're going to have an emerging world order, there is reason to be hopeful, particularly now. We're going to reduce the missiles in Europe. There's talk even of 50% reduction in strategic weapons. There seems to be a new air coming out of the Soviet Union, and it could be seen in some hopeful terms that we may be coming. And I wonder if it did, out of that convention we want to talk about, or that conference that you had, whether was there a general sense of optimism that came out of that convention that was reflected in the broader realities of the geopolitical arrangement of things and so forth? Are people becoming a little more optimistic?
I think there was. I mean, just in the short term, I think the conference would have been much more pessimistic if it were held in '83, let's say, during the deployment of the Pershing IIs, or '82. You know, those were very tense times. But I think the participants had a sense that something really could be done, a much more positive outlook.
Which is perhaps reflecting the realities as they're emerging in the day-to-day. But you had, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's important also, the concepts that I outlined to you earlier about nuclear war being illegal. If nuclear weapons were used, it would violate international law. The conference resulted in a joint statement of the U.S. and the Soviet lawyers, as well as the lawyers from the other nations, that adopted that exact position, that the principles of international law would prohibit the use of nuclear weapons. Now, to have that strong a statement adopted by lawyers from both sides and from other parties was perhaps one of the real positive things to come out.
How many were there from the Soviet Union in that delegation? And what did they represent? The Soviet Lawyers Association? Or they were representing top-level officials, really, in some cases, right?
Well, the name of the organization is the Association of Soviet Lawyers.
Right.
They had 30 delegates there. There were 100 Americans overall. And the Association of Soviet Lawyers is essentially a voluntary group for lawyers who want to have more contact with foreign lawyers outside of the Soviet Union.
Tend to be international lawyers themselves?
Tend to be international lawyers. They include the top international law scholars in the Soviet Union, in addition to some of the high-ranking legal officials. For example, the head of their delegation is a fellow named Alexander Sukharev, who is the Minister of Justice in the Russian Republic. Now, that's the equivalent of a state attorney general here, perhaps the New York State Attorney General. So they were a more governmental group than us. Our group is a private educational group of concerned lawyers.
But it's good to have that kind of a concern of the people that have that sense of that, and also to lay the groundwork for strengthening international in and of itself, or international institutions. Are you heartened by Mr. Gorbachev's recent address about the strengthening of the United Nations in general, the strengthening of the rule of international law?
I am. I'm very heartened. And I have to read the statement more closely. But it looked like a very good beginning. Anytime you begin to talk about U.S.-Soviet relations, of course, you talk about questions also of Afghanistan, of human rights violations, of possible treaty violations. Now, whatever credence one puts in those things, those are issues that are going to come up and be questioned with respect to Mr. Gorbachev's article. But I think what he said, for the leader of one of the two superpowers to come out with such a broad statement about international law and an international order is phenomenal.
It is, because much of it was said in such a way that would sound to some who are schooled in geopolitics, realpolitik and so forth, as sounding almost idealistic and so forth. International lawyers, I think, and idealistically inclined international lawyers are often, I think, probably tarred with that same brush of saying that they tend to be idealistic and not realistically seeing the power relationships between the nations. But the thrust of it was that there is a new emerging material reality that calls for new possibilities that might well have been idealistic in the past. I wonder, do you ever get a sense of that among yourselves, that there are new possibilities emerging out of the material realities of the world that might be heartening for international relations and for the prospects of the human society?
Well,
no.
My sense is that perhaps people are coming to a point where they see several options for the future, and one is a continuation of the policies that we have now, of some sort of nuclear deterrence. My feeling is that if you get outside of the Henry Kissingers or those from the realpolitik school of thought, people don't have much faith that nuclear deterrence is going to last over the long run. You know, you can say, well, the last 40 years have been without war. Well, if there's a war 5 years from now or 10 years from now, then the last 40 years without war won't mean a whole bunch. So there's a sense of moving away from nuclear deterrence, and even President Reagan expresses this in his Strategic Defense Initiative, that we have to move to an era where nuclear weapons are impotent and obsolete. I think the heart of the Star Wars program is questioning nuclear deterrence. Now, most lawyers from the group I represent would not agree with the solution, that is, trying to find a technological fix, some kind of a magic shield. Our feeling is that nuclear deterrence has to be abandoned at some point, and the only way to do that is by strengthening the legal order, strengthening the way that nations relate in a non-violent basis, non-militarily. It's a tall order.
Yeah, it is a tall order indeed, and it's one that whether or not the material realities are there that are going to permit the nations of the world to function in a more harmonious way than they have been able to do historically, and on a major proportion, if we're thinking in terms of the reduction of the deterrence and the rhetoric and the thinking and the psychological, the sociology of the Cold War and adversarial position, it might call for a really qualitative transformation in the human condition, that we might be coming to a time when peace and the institutions of peace would be able to be instituted in a long term and effective means? I don't know. Can you see an optimistic scenario?
I can see one.
In very, very large optimistic terms. I mean, that if the living capability could be brought to the providing of service to the human society, we would be able to tackle the ancient scourges and the end of the rationale or the reasons for inordinate sovereignty and inordinate national limitation, which has been the hallmark of the modern experience, could be able to begun to see a more federated, a more easily coexisting world, as it were. Without waxing too idealistic.
Yeah, it's a dreamy vision.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason for our group's existence is to explore these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, can we move toward this kind of a legal order, a more peaceful world?
Are there conditions that allow us to do it?
Are there conditions that might allow us to do that? And my sense is that most of the pressure for doing this is going to come from citizens in this country, from citizens in the Soviet Union, from individuals in all different nations around the world. I mean, one of the interesting aspects of our conference was that we didn't limit it to a U.S.-Soviet dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a nuclear war, the Argentinians will be affected, the Chileans will be affected, the Australians will be affected, the Japanese will be affected.
Yeah,
and each of them has something important to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
And my feeling is, if there's going to be a change toward this vision that you're drawing for us here, it's going to come through people, individuals, telling their governments enough times that, you know, we're a little bit tired of having our lives threatened every day.
Yeah.
It's surprising to me that if you look at it from above, that the only way the superpowers feel that they can keep from going to war is by threatening their mutual suicide on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's absurd.
But it seems at the same time like we would like to call ourselves a just or a civilized world, and those two ideas just don't seem too consistent.
It's a schizophrenic world that we live in. You know? I mean, to paraphrase an old song and so forth. But the speech of Mr. Mr. Gorbachev's recently does call the situation absurd. There are people in positions who will call the situation absurd, and the need to sort of move away from it. It's interesting you say the third world or other countries, because it is, when you think about it, the fallout, the effects of the nuclear weapons as they exist. Other nations of the world can be destroyed by those. I mean, it's the ultimate terror, in a sense. If you say the effects of terrorism, or the terrorism that might be in the use of nuclear weapons against peoples who we could destroy, they can't destroy us, we could destroy them. You understand? I mean, there really is a part to be played, all people in the world, given the power that exists. It does strike terror in the heart of people who they think about it.
I mean, how would you feel if you lived in Sri Lanka and you weren't sure whether you thought capitalism, democracy, or a sort of a socialist state was a better idea? You weren't. You hadn't had a. You know, you didn't have a verdict on that yet.
Yeah.
But yet, the dispute over that issue was threatening your life. I mean, how do you feel as an outside observer to a suicidal conflict?
Yeah, between two others that are going to do you in. I mean, you know, it's not like the shootout at the OK Corral is going to get the observers.
Yeah. And you know, many of the third world people who came to our conference also emphasized the relation between militarism and military spending and their own development. I mean, there's serious economic issues that relate to the military world as well.
Yeah.
I know that a very important professor from Japan, Professor Sakamoto, in his talk at our conference, said that a lot of countries outside of the superpowers or the nuclear powers don't really care so much about nuclear weapons per se, or even nuclear war. Nuclear war is a hypothetical threat, something that they might be able to visualize in the future. What they care about is the starvation of their people today and the lack of development in their countries. And so sometimes it's important to get outside of the U.S.-Soviet aspect itself.
Or even to see it on a world scale, that so much of the resource, at some point, the resources that are drained off from good living repurpose, again to use that term, that could be used to meet the scourges of hunger and so forth on a world scale, and that are wasted in a very literal sense, particularly the strategic weapons that can never be, it's literally wasted money that could be put to good purpose in terms of alleviating human suffering, of which God knows there's enough of in this world, and the alleviation of that human suffering might have more to do with creating a peaceful, just world, I mean, have a geostrategic significance than all of the weapons. I mean, the finding of a way of dealing with that question is one that should be dealt with.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
And, you know, just to get back to the essential point that we've been talking about, you know, my feeling is that nuclear weapons are basically inhumane, and they're terribly unjust. And if we do want to move toward a world without nuclear weapons, we're going to have to start looking toward these dreamy, lofty goals of international relations. I think the UN, as much as it's maligned by people and as much as it is ineffective, is an incredible experiment in terms of international relations. It's been a very historical and important experiment, and a good foundation to build on.
Yeah, it has, and well ought to be built up and underpinned. And then the rationale and the thinking and the build-up of the body of international law, and the respect for international law, and the respect for, I suppose in a certain sense, it's a respect for thinking of the world as a whole. That increased kind of thinking is to be encouraged among the peoples of the world and the leadership of the world in order to build the conditions that would allow for these political realities. What we're spelling out really is, if we get past the threats to war, and if we had the war-making capability put to the things that alienate people, as you said in the third world, from starvation or from other things, we might be able to create a war where the conditions, a world where the conditions where people felt they had to go to war could be lessened, and that would be almost, again, we could be almost millennial, what we could make this world work in a very real sense. And it's almost that we have to do that now, almost in a cosmic sense or something, if you understand what I mean. It's a major break point in the human experience.
Well, I also think it's important to point out that these ideas we're talking about disarmament, not just nuclear disarmament, but also conventional disarmament, development of nonviolent mechanisms for resolving disputes. These are not just ideas that we're pulling out of nowhere. A lot of these ideas are found in treaties that have been signed already by the U.S. and the Soviets. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example, in its preamble, the superpowers say that they're dedicated to complete disarmament under effective international control. That call also appears in the 1963 Test Ban Treaty. So these same ideas that we're talking about, as millennial as they sound, have even been approached by some of the high-level realist diplomats and in agreements that have been signed.
Yeah, right. And there ought to be some teeth put into that law, and there ought to be some real teeth put into the body of international law that's going to prevent us from nuclear absurdity. Right? Yeah, right.
And I think the teeth, again, is in part international lawyers like the ones associated with our group who are articulating the issues. But even more, it's private citizens who are just afraid enough to start talking about these issues.
Yeah, right.
In a more far-reaching way.
In a more far-reaching way, and let some of the voices of those citizens begin to be reflected by their government leadership and so forth. Seems to me, again, I don't want to overly tout it or anything, but the piece that Mr. Gorbachev recently put forth was in that vein. Very much common sense and talking to things in a very common sense level, and that's to be encouraged. And certainly your conference, I congratulate you on that and all the work of the committee over the years of its foundation, and may it prosper into a more peaceful world that is helping to build, right? But it's been a great pleasure talking with you. It's been a pleasure for you, then, to have had here the perceptions of Alex Miller. He's the executive director of an extremely interesting organization, Lawyers Committee here on Nuclear Policy, headquartered here in New York. Happy to have been able to bring you those perceptions, and we here in Conversations invite you to tune in again next week. We'll be coming back again next week, but that's it for this particular segment and program, and we thank you for viewing. Mr. Miller, once again, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good night. We'll see you next week.
Here are some upcoming highlights from our recent series which featured Ravi Batra, author of The Great Depression of 1990. And in another program, Louis O. Kelso, the author of Democracy and Economic Power. Tune in each Wednesday at 11 for current conversations on issues facing today's world.
Usually occurring every 60 years, but sometimes, at least once, it occurred over a 30-year time period. But I also found that each time there was a depression, there was a massive wealth concentration also.
Interesting.
So I connected the two together. But along with the depression, just before a depression, there was also a huge stock market bubble.
Yes,
Speculative bubble.
Yes,
So I thought to myself that this concentration of wealth and the speculative bubble must have a connection. Like Catchman has also talked about increasing concentration of wealth in the past and now.
The state has got to be responsible, and it set out on a war on the effects of poverty, not the cause. In other words, it discovered the right road, but it set the whole society off in the wrong direction by 180 degrees.
Even in the early 80s, they were hoping that my forecast would be wrong, and they have been wrong. My forecasts have been constantly right. I think there's something wrong with their theory, which gives them wrong forecasts. And there is something right with my theory, which always leads to right forecasts.
Yeah.
One of the principal factors that he sees as creating a depression is the inordinate concentration of ownership in the upper echelons of the society. I mean, the concentration of wealth.
Yes, he pointed to both the concentration of wealth and concentration of income.
And you would agree with that as an underlying cause of what leads to speculative boom?
We say essentially the same thing in Democracy and Economic Power. We don't say it in such alarming terms. We aren't alarmist, but on the other hand, I think it's probably time to be alarmed. 2 years to even begin conditioning the society for a really total collapse that'll make the 29 depression look mild. To do that in 2